Hi, this is a Screenwriting Deconstructed 2, Building Stories. The only reason I'm calling it number 2 is because it's the second one that I'm doing. It does not predicate on any knowledge from the first one. So if you took the last class, awesome. If you didn't, there's nothing in here that you're going to miss out, like you'd be watching the sequel of a movie or something. I should probably rename it, but is what it is. So this one is mainly going to be about the lessons that will help you actually build your story, for whether you're writing a pilot or a feature or whatever it is you're writing. So just a little plug for my business here real quick, and then we'll get to the good stuff. I'm a private coach. I coach a lot of different disciplines: writing, improv, acting, etc. With writers specifically, I want to help writers ideate, motivate, and elevate. So whether that's giving feedback on the current draft of your script, giving people assignments and holding their feet to the fire as far as what's going next, and just to help come up with ideas. If you're stuck, or just throw stuff at you until it sparks something in you. If you're interested in that, I'm going to be putting a lot more free resources on Rich Baker Coaching on Facebook. And if you want to reach out to me for any reason, feel free to email me. If you have a different email for me, that's fine. But you can also use therichbaker@gmail.com. So today we're going to go over is what exactly is the writer's job? What is a story? The difference between linear and non-linear, the different needs that a story has, your characters and how to use change for your characters, and then finally sticking the landing, how to end your script. Then we'll end with a little Q&A, be the last thing. So if you have questions that you brought in about screenplays, there'll be a time for that, or if any questions come up throughout this, feel free to ask that at the end. Okie dokie. So what is our job as a writer? Well, we're both designers and we're builders. The way that has helped me figure out, to put it in terms that help me actually get the thing done, is we're widget makers. We make widgets, except instead of widgets, little mechanical things or plastic things, we make stories. So our job is to build these. And the reason that I stress that is, for me as a writer specifically, and a lot of writers I know, we're writers in our own minds, in that we can see how stories work and we have these ideas in our head, but you're not really a writer until you've actually built a story, something in a reproducible format that other people can read or eventually watch, right? So we design the story, and then we build the story, and then we hand it off to someone else. Or if we're also directors or whatever, we'll take it from there. But as the writer's job, that's our job, is to create these scripts. So I like to think of it as an architect and as a construction crew all at the same time. The idea of we're thinking of it and then we make it. So there's, I've heard this several times from different people in Hollywood over the years, and it's really helped me. The idea that the screenplay, if you're a writer, and on any particular project, if you're just the writer, and I don't mean that in any disparaging way, I just mean your job is to write the screenplay. Know that whatever winds up in the finished product of the movie or the pilot or whatever it is that you write will almost certainly be a different version of your story than what you set out. So in other words, the script is awesome. That's our job as writers, is to come up with a script. If you're also a director, your job is to take that script and direct it on set, which there's going to be changes. The main point I want you to take away from this, though, is if your job is to write and then let it go, then you have to be okay with the fact that it's not going to be exactly what you thought of. If you're a novelist, you're writing books, novelists are pretty much, they're solely responsible for the content. And that's awesome. But it's a different kind of thing. A novelist, hands you their book and, they know that everything they wrote was in it. Whereas a screenplay, once you hand it off, you gotta be willing to let it go. If you're directing your own stuff, the idea as a director, if you're trying to be super married to every detail of the screenplay, what's going to happen is you might miss some magic that's happening in the moment on set when someone does something different. I'm sure we've all heard many examples, but one of my favorites is, "We're going to need a bigger boat." The famous line from Jaws was improvised. And there are tons of different moments in movies and TV shows over the years of the things that that stick out. And remember that we're not in the actual script itself. And as screenwriters, we need to not only be okay with that, but celebrate that. That's part of the movie making magic. So the screenplay that we write is going to be a little different from the screenplay that the director directs, and it's going to be a little bit different from the screenplay that winds up being the final edit. Okie dokie. So what is a story? I know this may sound super basic and simple, but oftentimes one of the things that gets me stuck in my head is trying to make things complicated. I like to simplify things down. So a story is a sequence of events. So if I say I got up this morning, that is not a story. It's an event. But if I say I got up this morning and I walked my dog, that's a story. It's not a good one, but it's a story. So we're going to figure out, okay, so if that's our basic what is a story, what makes for a good story? Before we get into the details of that, I just want to deal with linear versus non-linear real quick. Linear stories, and nowadays, let me just preface this by saying nowadays, almost every story out there, screenplay, TV show, or otherwise, is going to have its foot a little bit in both camps, right? If you have a linear story, but you have a flashback, technically it's non-linear by definition, but it's mostly a linear story that's got one flashback in it, right? What I'm less worried about the specifics of the definition and more about just what is the essence of the story we're trying to tell. So if you remember the TV show Lost from 2006, if you didn't see it, it was very much predicated on non-linear storytelling. That would be a very different show if they just told the story from one moment to the next. But every single episode, or at least most of them, maybe all of them, I don't remember all of the later seasons as well, but it was you as an audience member, you watched that show with the expectation that you were going to see some events happening in the quote unquote present time, and then a lot of other events happening in the past. And then sometimes with that show, it even threw a bunch of monkey wrenches out there, would even be the future. It had this weird like interplay of the three. It was definitely non-linear storytelling. Whereas a movie like Three Billboards Outside of Ebbing, Missouri, clip featured there on the left, that's very much a linear story. The very first scene starts at one point, and then every scene thereafter is the next moment, or further along in the timeline. So this, I just wanted you to know this because as a writer, it's like, is your story, something that needs to require nonlinear storytelling? Is it the expectation that you're putting out there? Something to keep in mind. What I love about these two words is they're very versatile because it's not only about the actual story that you create, it's about your process. So when I started as a screenwriter, I always wrote linearly. In other words, I would start with scene one and I would just move on, and I'd build my rough draft, a sequence of events, starting with scene one all the way to the end. And what I have discovered for me personally over the years is that nonlinear way of tackling it has helped me out a lot more. If anyone has their mic on, if any noise making, if anyone mind muting that, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Sorry, that's my dad. He doesn't know. Dad? Dad, mute your screen. Lower left. Sorry, Rich.
No worries. We're all learning here. It's all good.
Lower left mute. I see it.
I love that.
So good.
Great. Okay, so now when I write screenplays, I I don't think I've written in linear process in forever. So what I tend to do is I write the scene that most interests me at the moment. I come up with my outline of basically what I want, and then I go, you know what scene I feel like writing today is the climax scene where the good guy's doing this, the bad guy's doing this, and I'll write that scene. And then I go, okay, maybe today I feel like writing that moment where everything goes wrong for the character. And my point for telling this is I think a lot of us think in terms of linear because it's just the most obvious to most of us, but it's not necessarily always the best for your process. Right? So feel free to dip your toe into linear or nonlinear and experiment and see what works best for you. There we go. Okie dokie. Elements of a story. So we could break down stories into all kinds of different elements, but the four that I want to talk about right now that I think are super helpful for us to get our heads behind as writers are clarity, links, compulsion, and stakes. Okay, so briefly what those mean. Clarity is simply the idea that if I'm reading your screenplay, am I clear on what's happening, who the characters are, where it's going, like what the feel, what the tone is, etc. Like, are we as writers making it clear to our readers what's going on, right? Links are, I don't know if that's the best picture. That's the link between trains, those little, I don't know what they're called, but the thing that link trains together. Links are invisible, but they're super important, and we're going to talk about those. What is linking so if a story is a sequence of events, what links those events together? Okay? Compulsion is this idea of like, what about my story is compelling a reader to read the next page, to want to read to the end. And lastly, stakes are what build and release the tension in a satisfying way, right? So every story is really tension. Tension is absent, tension is there, tension goes away, what increases it, what decreases it, etc. Okay, so let's talk about clarity. Two very different movies here. The one on the left, John Wick, and the one on the right, Moana. Very different movies as far as genre. One's animated, one's not, etc. But what I love about both of them is they are very, very clear, right? So if you haven't seen it, John Wick, and there's no big spoilers here. It's not really a movie that's about the story anyway. It's about action. But John Wick is the most feared assassin in the world. He is a retired assassin. Someone comes after him, kills his dog. Now he's going to kill everyone. That's the story. Very, very clear. They let you know in the first few scenes, this guy is a total badass. He is retired. And he is not cool with them killing his dog. And that's the mission of like, take out everyone. You know right away what you're watching. And if that's your genre, if you're into action, chances are you're in. Because that's, we're just going to kill everyone? Cool. Right. Moana, a very different movie, but also very, very clear, right? We know she's the chief's daughter, who's next in line to be the chief herself. So she's a leader. She's got to lead her people, right? We know that her island is dying. They can't grow anything. There's all kinds of problems, and we know that in order for her to save her island, she is going to have to return the heart of Te Fiti, right? So she's got to go on an adventure to take the heart to Te Fiti, save her island, be the leader. Very, very clear, easy to get behind. And her character, like breaking it down a little further, we know that she's a badass. We know that she's a dreamer. We know that she's a good daughter, and that's the conflict, right? She wants to obey her parents, but at the same time, she knows that in order to be the leader she needs to go on this voyage around the world, which is expressly forbidden by her parents. So again, very, very clear what's going on. As people who watch these movies and enjoy them, it makes it so much easier to watch them knowing these things very, very clearly. So what as screenwriters we need to do is make sure that, and it's even harder on the page because it's easier to follow along when you're watching something and hearing different voices. We as screenwriters need to do that on the page. Okay, links. This is one of my favorite lessons to teach, and it's totally stolen from Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park and Team America and all Book of Mormon, a bunch of other awesome stories out there. So if a story is a sequence of events, what links those events? And these are invisible. They're not going to appear in your screenplay, but they have a huge effect on your screenplay. If the word "and" is what links your two events, is probably not helpful. So this event happens, and this event happens, and this event happens. That's probably not going to be something that most of us can get our heads behind that's going to be interesting to us, right? And the word "so" I put in there, that depends on how you say it, but like, this happens, so this happens, right? It's just more of like the events happen, but they're not linked in a very strong way. The way to link events in a story, whoops-a-doodle, Let's go back. Sorry about that. The way to link events in a way that's satisfying is the word but and the word therefore. So this event happens. Therefore, this event happens. But this event happens. Therefore, this event happens, right? So therefore is the natural conclusion, the result of what the previous thing, because because there's an asteroid coming towards Earth, therefore everyone's panicking, right? Therefore we need someone to solve it, right? But the only one who can really solve the asteroid problem isn't really an astronaut. So therefore they've got to go into astronaut training. And yes, of course, this is the plot to the 2000 movie. 2000, I don't remember when it came out. Armageddon. I don't know why. I just throwing random example out there. But so the word "but," if it's between the events in your sequence, that is putting the tension on of, oh, this is now in the way of the goal. And therefore is the outcome of what happens next. So whenever you're looking at your screenplay, if you can't say the word but or therefore between your scenes, and it's just the word and, then chances are they're not linked in a way that is going to be as satisfying. Love that lesson. When I first heard that, about 12 years ago or something, it just blew my mind. Okay, compulsion. This is another thing that's invisible, but super, super important. What is compelling the reader to keep reading? Okay, so if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, this is the log line. I use this in my last class too. A high school chemistry teacher diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer turns to manufacturing and selling methamphetamine in order to secure his family's future. Okay, I'm in. Just knowing that, I'm in. Right? You think of the world of selling methamphetamine, and you think of the world of teaching high school chemistry as being wholly different from each other. So we've got a character who's going to go from one thing, family man, high school chemistry teacher, to selling meth, and to help out his family. This is the kind of thing that is going to compel me, and clearly compel the entire world, to stick with a show for 6 seasons. What is it about your screenplay, your pilot? What is it about what you're writing that is compelling to the reader that's going to make us keep reading? Because I don't think I mentioned this yet today, but and you probably already know this. If someone is reading your script, now if they're a good friend, this doesn't count because a good friend's going to read your whole thing because they're a good friend. But most people that you want to read your script probably aren't your best friend. There's someone who's going to help you get it funded, help you sell it to a production company, something like that. So they need to be compelled to read past that first page. If they're reading that first page and it's not clear what's happening, right? And what's happening isn't all that compelling, they're probably not going to read the rest of it. They just don't have the time. Okie dokie. Stakes. Good old stakes. They're not just for vampires anymore. What are the consequences of what you're writing? What's going to happen or not happen that's going to be important? Why do we care? Okay. So the TV show Heroes from 2006, the tagline, at least for that first season, was "Save the cheerleader, save the world." Literally, the world was at stake. Now, this may sound cheesy if you've seen a lot of Marvel movies or different superhero movies, different things like that, because it's always the fate of the world. But guess what? That's a high stake. It's always going to be a high stake because we as human beings want the world to survive. So if the world is under threat, then the stakes aren't necessarily high, right? So everything in that first season was about the world is in danger. We need to save this cheerleader in order they didn't know exactly what was going on, so we had to figure all that out, but we knew what the stakes were. The world is going to end if we don't figure this out. It doesn't always have to be the fate of the world by any stretch. So in the movie Up, wonderful movie, if you haven't, probably most people have seen it. If you haven't seen it, the hardest part to watch, the most emotionally tear-jerking part, happens in the beginning of the movie, which is pretty rare. But the way they do it is brilliant because they set up this sequence of events to show you, the relationship between the main character and his wife Ellie, and then the rest of the movie everything that he's doing, it's for her memory, right? It's for Ellie. Like the adventure they always wanted to take, and now he's doing it not just for himself and her, but for also this boy, and now there's a dog involved, etc. But we know the stakes are, he's doing this for the memory of his dead wife. Big stakes, right? So what are the stakes? And you're saying, what's going to matter if this does happen or if this doesn't happen, the main action of your story. Cool, cool, cool. All right, characters and change. So I have an example from TV and example from movies here because it's a little different, typically speaking. In a movie, you want your character to have a change from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie that's going to feel like a permanent life change, right? So this is still from In the Heat of the Night. If you haven't seen it, it's about a black detective who comes down to the South to help solve a murder, and it's I think it was the 60s, so pretty racist South here. And we want to cheer for Tibbs, played by Sidney Poitier. He's the famous line, "They called me Mr. Tibbs," which just shivers down my spine every time. He's going to change a little bit as the story goes on because he's going to be a little bit more, he's going to become a little bit more friendly with and care about Gillespie, who is, this town sheriff, I think he's sheriff cop. Anyway, he's an authority figure of some kind. And he is clearly racist and says some terrible things in the beginning. By the end of the movie, he's not so racist, and he actually defends Tibbs and the idea of like people being racist. So we see this racist change a little bit and become more of a person as is exposed to someone of a different race. Fantastic. The end of the movie, these characters have changed a little bit. They've taken us on this journey, and that is very satisfying. In television, often, and there's a lot of wiggle room here, but this is still from Modern Family if you haven't seen it, the characters will learn something and change a little bit by the end of the episode, but oftentimes what's going to happen is in the beginning of the next episode, they're still going to fall into some of those same kinds of traps. So think of it like this. Your characters in a movie, they have to learn one, maybe a couple, but mainly just think about like one lesson that's going to change their lives. Whereas in TV, they need to keep learning life lessons over and over and over. So if you haven't seen Modern Family, at the end of it, there's always this like kind of heartfelt, like, family's really important, or I should be more patient, or I should da-da-da-da-da, right? And then they get into hijinks and foibles and whatnot in the next episode as well. So depending on what you're going for, you need your characters to change, but in what way are they going to change that's going to keep your story going? Okie doke. So when it comes to change, there are always two things. There are always two ways for your characters to change, and they're both super important. And I think it's easy for people to watch movies and TV and realize that there's an external goal. That's the main crux of what brings us into the movie or the TV show, but it's the internal goal that's super important too. So this, if you haven't seen the show Happy on Sci-Fi, it's based on a series of graphic novels. The exterior goal is Sax, played by Christopher Maloney. He has to save his family from the bad guys. That is clearly the external goal. Family's in trouble, gotta save them. Cool. His internal goal, the thing that changes from the beginning of the first season to the end of the first season, is in the beginning of the first season, he is a loner. He doesn't care about anyone else. He doesn't have anyone else's life. By the end of the season, he learns to become a family man, to connect with people, to rely on other people, right? Both of those are super important, and that story would not be nearly as compelling if it did not have both of those intertwined. Something that you probably all seen, Finding Nemo, Marlin, the dad, he needs to save his son. That's his external goal, obviously. But he also needs to learn how to be a different kind of fish. In the beginning, he's afraid of everything. He's only concerned about the survival of his son, and that's it. He'll do anything in his world to protect him. He doesn't have friends. He doesn't have any kind of life. He just worries about protecting his son. By the end of the movie, he's gone on adventures. He has friends now. He can say the joke that he kept botching earlier about being a clownfish, and he respects his son's autonomy, right? So he changes throughout the course of this thing, and that's super important. So I cannot emphasize enough how much the internal and external goals are important. So here's 3 different ways to put it. It's both the two sides of the same coin. It's yin and yang. It's the it's the double helix of DNA. They're inextricable, right? So when you're writing your story, if you think about it in terms just of an external goal, I highly encourage you to, before you get to start writing, what is the internal goal? What is the internal change that's going to be happening in your character too? Because they not only are both super important, they go together, and they cannot be on. Iron Man would be a very different movie if it was just about a guy getting in, building an Iron Man suit for himself and then fighting his old business partner and saving the day, right? That's a fine story, but what we really care about in Iron Man, and what has gone through the entire MCU from that movie up until in Endgame, was that Iron Man, was this selfish, just worried about money, just worried about showing off, getting with different women and being the center of attention. And then, he becomes this guy who cares deeply about the world, about his friends, about everyone else. He grows and he changes, and that is super important. So we've got to have both of those in the story. And if your internal change and your external goal don't go together, then find a new one. What is the thing that makes us care about your characters as they're achieving their goal? Okay, let's talk about conflict real quick. You can dice up conflict into a whole bunch of different ways. I like to do it in just 3, just to make it super simple. You've got person versus person, person versus nature, and person versus self. Okay. These are as far as external goals, right? Person versus person, this is super common. We see this all the time. And, again, you could divide this up into different things. So with Harry Potter, you've got an individual enemy, right? Harry Potter's trying to fight Voldemort, right? So we've got a person versus a person. And let's not get into the weeds of, is it a person or not? If it's a thinking creature who makes decisions and is human-esque, whether it's, whatever it is, then it's a person. It could be a person versus society, and that person versus person could be a whole bunch of people. For example, How to Train Your Dragon, it's really that story, the conflict is about Hiccup, and he's trying to change, his whole society is against dragons, right? So he has to go out there and change everyone's minds, right? And show them that dragons are not so bad. It could be groups of people. So Game of Thrones, it wasn't just individuals versus individuals. It was like the Starks versus the Lannisters versus the Greyjoys, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It could be just the way so How to Train Your Dragon was less about they were his enemies and more you need to change their minds. Whereas V for Vendetta, the whole society is fucked up, right? And it's we need to change society. It's not good, right? So person versus person can take all those different forms. Person versus nature. So earlier I quoted, I made reference to Armageddon. So its sister movie, Deep Impact, right? Everyone was trying to survive because nature was trying to kill them, right? A big asteroid is going to come down, kill everyone. So we gotta get together, figure that out. By nature, again, you could divide up any different ways. In 2001, it's man versus nature, but it's a machine, right? And that machine isn't like a person in that it's in the same way, but it's really almost like a force of nature. It's got one goal and it's just going to relentlessly pursue that. The Martian, Matt Damon's character is trying to survive the harsh poison atmosphere of Mars, right? The Ghost in the Darkness is person versus animal. So you've got these 2 killer lions, stopping the halt of a bridge being built in Africa. So you bring in the hunter of Michael Douglas, and it's man versus nature in the form of 2 animals. And then nature doesn't have to be nature as we know it. It can be fictional nature. So Dawn of the Dead, zombies are absolutely nature. They are not making choices like a person. They are a natural phenomenon. Fictional, but natural. All right, and then person versus self. Now this one's a tricky one for me. And maybe I just need to learn more about it, but to me, it's very, there are not a lot of examples, at least that I can think of, where the main story is just about someone against themselves. There's a few. I've got some examples here. But usually the person versus self part is that internal conflict, often. That said, you got a movie like Groundhog Day, where there is really no bad guy. It's not him versus anything particular. It's he's got, I guess you could argue it's him versus nature because he gets stuck in the same day. But what he discovers is that when he becomes a better person, a less selfish, more giving person, he can eventually get out of the predicament that he's in. So he's really his own obstacle there. The Sopranos, obviously, there's tons of external conflict throughout The Sopranos, but the main thing is Tony Soprano versus himself. That's why the first couple seasons is full of him talking to his therapist. It's him getting over his anger issues, his abandonment issues, all that kind of stuff. And then if you haven't seen BoJack Horseman, it's a show about it's a fun world where like animals and humans just coexist and they're all humanoid. They do a lot of jokes with that. But the main crux of the show is that this guy BoJack was on an 80s TV show or 90s TV show that was a hit, and ever since then he's just been this rich, isolated, actor, famous guy. Hearing a little bit of feedback. I hope people can still hear me. Getting some digital dust here. If there's any problems about hearing me or saying anything, just pop in, unmute, and tell me. Let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. Great. So BoJack's thing is he's got this severe depression, and he's always hijacking himself. Whenever some good fortune lands his way, he always finds a way to sabotage it. And so pretty much every episode is about him, and every season arc is him trying to overcome his own demons. So that's person versus self, even though he's a horse. All right. Lastly, how to stick the landing. So let's say you've compelled your reader, you've got stakes, you've linked all your events, everything's going great, you've got an internal change, you've got external goals. How do we land this plane? If you've seen anything ever, whether it's a musical or read a story or anything, if the ending isn't satisfying, then it tends to sour our taste on it, right? So how do we stick that landing? Of course, the biggest example, Game of Thrones, my opinion, one of the best shows ever. I think a lot of people's opinions it was. And then the last couple of seasons, it started to wane, and it just did not feel satisfying the way they ended that. So how do we stick the landing? So let's look at some examples of how other things have stuck the landing in the past, right? So Cheers. The last line of Cheers, sorry, we're closed, right? Very satisfying ending to one of the greatest sitcoms of all time. We're gonna break these down a little bit. I'm just gonna bullet through them right now. Sex and the City, she finally gets with Mr. Big. She finds the love of her life. The whole thing is about being single in the city, and then it ends with her finding her love, right? Thelma and Louise, a tragic ending, but a very satisfying one nonetheless, right? They're being chased by all the authorities, and they decide to drive over a cliff and end things there. This bottom one here is from One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest. Brilliant film. Its ending is also kind of tragic in a way because Jack Nicholson's character's name escaped me right now. He gets lobotomized or whatever. Sorry, spoiler alert for a 50-year-old movie. He gets lobotomized, and it is the thing that helps the chief, this character who we haven't heard speak. He's always been there, but we don't see much about him. It finally gives him the courage to do something. He has the strength to leave this place, and he always had, but he didn't have a reason to. Of course, Tony Montana from Scarface, the ending scene, comically large piles of cocaine and a machine gun, kills a lot of people until he dies himself. And then John Carpenter's The Thing, wonderful, thrilling horror movie that ends with, so the idea of The Thing, if you haven't seen it, is there's a thing that they can't define, but it's a shapeshifter. So you never know who or what is the actual bad guy, because it could be your best friend, or it could be, the dog or whatever. It ends with McCready. He's at the end, he thinks he's got everyone, and then Childs comes in, and they both kind of sit down, they're both exhausted, and they're like, well, we don't know if the other one's a thing, but screw it, whatever. So the reason why all these are satisfying endings is because it takes something central to the characters that we've been watching either over the seasons or over the course of the movie. And the thing that makes us love them is the thing that helps them make the final decision, right? So what is the thing that helps us out? So in Cheers, the whole crux of Cheers is it's where everyone knows your name. It's where people gather. It's always open. I mean, the opening scene of Cheers in the first season, it's definitely during the day. No one's there, but the bar's open, right? The bar's almost always, it's always open in every scene. And it ends with, sorry, we're closed. We're literally closing the door on this, right? Sex and the City was all about, can't figure out relationships, can't figure out men. And Mr. Big has been in the whole time. He's been in since the first episode. But what's satisfying about that is it's not that they got together, but they have both changed to a point to where they can be together, right? Thelma and Louise, the whole thing is about not being told what to do, not, bowing down to what other, living life on your own terms. And so when the cops have them surrounded, they still get to make the choice. You're not going to arrest us. We're going to end life on our own terms too. And that's when they decide to end it together. In the example of Tony Montana from Scarface, what's brilliant about this ending is that, it starts out with this guy who wants to just get out of poverty and become something. And it leads to him chasing this dream that he can never have enough cocaine. He can never have enough power. His house is ridiculous. And because he's just making these bad choices, it ends with him making the ultimate bad choice. And you get to see the downfall of this guy from beginning to end. So, just the idea of when you're sticking your landing, what is it about these characters that we have loved? What decisions can they make that go along with everything that we've seen so far that can feel like that satisfying ending of like, yep, this makes sense. They've changed in this way, so they've made this decision. Boom, done and done and done. A satisfying ending is always going to come from your story and your story's intent. Okay. So completing the sequence. So again, if we think about stories as a series of sequence, here's just two metaphors that help me out. One is a series of dominoes and one is a maze, right? So every time someone reads your screenplay, it's as if you've stacked up a whole bunch of dominoes and they've knocked over that first one and it keeps knocking them over, right? If we've set up our sequence of events, with good links and good stakes and everything, then one domino should hit the other, and it should feel like the satisfying all the way around until they fall, right? If you prefer the maze metaphor, a maze is basically a series of choices, right? So you get to a fork in the road, you go left, right, or forward, or whatever the choices are, and a screenplay takes your characters through these series of choices in a way that gets you out of the maze. Feels satisfying. So as a writer, what we need to do is develop a sense of what is satisfying, right? Oftentimes, we are too close to our own projects. So one thing I advise, if you're doing it all on your own, is write your story and then separate yourself from it for a while before, if you're stuck on how do I end this thing, put it on a shelf, let it marinate in your subconscious for a little while, and then start analyzing what are some things that had really satisfying endings to you. What, TV shows or movies, whatever it is that you're writing, felt good to you. And then just like the more you think on those and ruminate on those and just watch those, you're going to get a sense of, oh, this feels like a good ending. Of course, getting other people's opinions on does this feel like a good ending is always something helpful because they're not super close to your work. So whether it's a friend or a coach or a teacher, whoever it is that you're having read your stuff, right? Okie dokie. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. So I'm going to stop the screen share here, get back to me, and I would love to hear your questions. Who's got questions? I got Roberto. Good seeing your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself. What's up?
Yeah. Hey, what's going on? Thanks very much, by the way.
My pleasure.
I guess my question is, what is your process from like, oh, I have an idea to draft? Like how detailed is your outline? And do you have a specifically detailed process for breaking down individual scenes before you write them?
Yep, it's a great question. So process changes. At least for me, it's changed, right? So the way that I wrote screenplays in college, 15, 17, a while ago, is very different from the way I do it now, right? And so one thing you want to keep in mind as you write is that if you come up with like one rigid process and you try and stick with that, I have not found that has worked for me, and I haven't heard of that working for too many other people. What is more about experimentation, but just in general, for me, usually a story idea comes in the form of I kind of see the whole thing from a 10,000 foot view of like, what if I had a character do this in this world and they did this and this, that, and the other, and then it would win in here. So I have like a very brief kind of overview of where I see what's happening. That's just how it tends to hit my brain. So what I like to do is just anytime I get any ideas, I write down as much as I can, right? So I'm going to write down like, oh, here's the world. Here's the main character. Here's what's going to change about him, this, that, and the other. And then I know that whatever I write there is almost certainly going to change throughout the process that I take it through as well, right? So don't be married to any particular thing. For my money, what I like to do is I like to write an outline that can fit on one page, whether it's a pilot or a screenplay, no matter how long it is, I like to put it on one page because it's easier for my brain to see one thing rather than to flip back and forth between, oh, this happened here and then this happened here and then go back and forth, right? So boil it down to one page. And, if you've got a very detailed story, like, Game of Thrones or something like that, obviously that's going to be very difficult, but that's the point, is what is the essence of this story that can knock it down to one page worth of text. Then from there, I'll start, I'll either go into character descriptions because I really want to know my characters really well, and just write down like name and, anything that I think is germane to what's going to help the people follow them throughout the story, so that I can have that as, oh, he likes to use this phrase, or she loves dogs. So anytime I can put a dog in there and show off this thing, whatever it is, some kind of character traits. And then I start writing my screenplay, the first draft, and I have my outline over here and I have my character descriptions over here. And I'm just kind of stream of conscious writing, and I'll refer back to those two things to help me out. The one thing I haven't mentioned yet, and I mentioned this in the previous class, but it's worth talking about again, log lines they're huge, and they're tests, right? Because whatever your log line is the essence of your entire story. So if I can come up with my log line ahead of time, it's my test. Anytime I write a scene or even a bit of dialogue, I look at my log line and go, is this reflecting the thesis of what I was trying to put in there? And sometimes I go, it isn't, and then I just write something totally different. Or I go, it isn't, but I like this better, so I'm going to go back and revamp my log line, which may also mean revamping my character descriptions and or my outline. And as a writer, like, it's tedious, but it's part of my process. So like, it's easy to get frustrated and go, oh, I've written 4 scenes, and now I want to go back and change it all. Yep, that's writing. So if you find yourself in that position, do that. But anyway, then I finish building out the first draft, and from there, that's when I start seeking out. That's when I put it on a shelf and I give myself some time. I always give myself at least a week, sometimes longer, between finishing my first draft and then rereading it, editing it, because I want some space between me and that first draft. Great question. Susan.
Unmute there. When you were talking, hi, by the way, thanks.
Hello.
The 2 goals, internal, external. When you have a protagonist in a romantic comedy, would the growth be more? Because I feel like I get the internal growth. Usually, it has to do with bravery or willing to accept love and all that kind of stuff. External growth, maybe I'm a little more wonky about, as far as somebody who wants love and then finds love at the end. It's not much of a growth there, is it? Other than they got what they wanted?
Yeah. If I said external growth, forgive me, I didn't mean to. External goal is the way that I put it, right? So the internal goal is more like a growth thing, like a life lesson that you learn, whereas the external is an actual achievable goal in the physical world.
I wrote it down. My bad.
Oh, good. So in romantic, depending on your genre, so romantic comedies, typically the goal is they get together, right? Or they figure out, in the beginning, they either have a bad love life or no love life, and then by the end they have a good love life, right? So sometimes the genre just makes it nice and easy for you. Good questions. Others? Yes, Ben.
Yeah, you mentioned clarity being a part of your elements of a good story. So I'm wondering how to make something more clear, especially under circumstances where I'm dealing with like a supernatural concept, which can just be very confusing and not clear to begin with. But yeah, so I wonder how you might work to make something more clear, or maybe some hurdles that have to deal with that sort of supernatural genre.
Yeah, so again, this is genre specific is really a good thing to keep in mind here, right? Because like Star Wars is not clear to my mother, she will never understand Star Wars, right? And it's just not her bag. Like it's, she's like, yep, too much, I'm out, right? Whereas people who like Star Wars love to get into the nitty gritty of like, ooh, what race of alien is this, and whatever, right? So if you're writing like sci-fi or fantasy, you can get away with a little bit more of that stuff than if you're writing, like a straight action movie or a romantic comedy or something like that. But in general, the only way that I know how to make things more clear is to have other people read them and tell you, right? Because I am so close to my characters and my story that of course it's clear to me, because in my head all the details are there, and you physically cannot put all the details into any screenplay that you write. So, but because you're reading it, it's gonna be very difficult for you to separate it, right? That's why I don't know anyone, I've never heard of anyone at least, who just writes a screenplay completely on their own and then sells it. I mean, maybe Tarantino, maybe, people on that level, but like, especially if you're starting out or you don't have a name yet, like get other people to tell you like, oh, I read this and I just didn't understand the character's motivation. Now, depending on who you give it to, they may not be able to tell you to offer you ideas on how to work around it, but they can at least tell you a litmus test of, I didn't get it, I didn't follow it, or whatever. And then, if you have someone and like who's written screenplays or knows a lot about it, they can tell you like, I didn't get this, but if you only gave me some kind of other character who came in and did this or whatever, like that's what I do when people give me stuff to read. It's like I throw out different ideas of like, if you want to clarify this, you could do this way, you could do that way, and then it's up to you as a writer which way you want to go. But you need someone else to tell you that.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do it on my own. I wish I did. That'd be really cool. Good questions. Any others? Jeremy.
So, what's your view on the relationship of doing research versus the actual act of storytelling, and when do you reach a point where you say enough's enough, and how does it vary between, say, rough draft and fine-tuning future drafts?
A lot of questions in there. Hopefully I get...
you can pick one.
Tell me if I don't get to them all, because I think I got it. Research versus writing depends on what you're writing, right? So if you want, let's say, so the movie Ford versus Ferrari, if you saw that one, brilliant film, based on actual historical events. I don't know anything about cars. I know very little about the particular history of that movie. So as someone, just watching that movie, I just assumed they did all their research and did it right? But it didn't actually matter to me because I just wanted a good story. But if someone's like a car head or like, really want, motorhead or whatever, and really is into that, if you want them to like it, you want to do your research so that they don't go, well, actually, Gerald Ford, blah, 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 whatever. So it just depends on who you're trying to reach, right? If you're writing in the fantasy genre, you don't need to do any research. You can make up anything you want, right? If you're writing The Martian, for example, talked about earlier, like, that guy did a ton of research. Not everything in the movie is accurate. There's a lot of things in the movie that are made up that aren't actually real in our real world, but there's a lot of stuff that is. And, what's the balance that you want to go for it? So when it comes to research, it's really about your goal. What kind of screenplay do you want? Do you want something that people will look at and go, wow, this is accurate? Or do you not care? And either way is fine. Doesn't matter. There's plenty of examples of both where, someone took a historical event or something real and then just made up a bunch of stuff that wasn't true, and that's fine. They're going to get haters for the sticklers, and if you're good with that, go for it. Or if you really want to do the research, that's awesome too. I believe your other question was about rough draft to next draft, like how much you do. That's an individual process. I've gone through 7 drafts on some of my stuff. And I've gone through 3 on some of my others, right? It's up to you when you find it, when you want to be finished. But the same thing I said to Ben, you're finished when you feel satisfied and when you hand it to someone else and their feedback is in line with what you want a reader's feedback to look like. Like, oh, I really loved it when this happened, this, that, and the other. Boom, you nailed it, right? Or if they're like, I didn't quite get this, then you didn't. Cool. Dad. That's what it comes up there, so that's what I call you.
The rules or the guidance that you're describing, every so often a piece of work comes along that violates some, all, whatever
Sure.
And what makes them successful? What makes them fail?
The short answer is if it goes against what we can measure, then we just don't know, right? Like why can Quentin Tarantino like throw just about every rule out the window and still make what he makes and people love it? I don't know, but I know as an artist, I've written like stand-up jokes, or I've performed scenes or different things that just didn't match anything that any teacher would ever tell you, yet it worked in the moment. So it's about those instincts as a writer, right? If your instincts are telling you, yeah, I get that this doesn't make any sense compared to what people are telling me, but I know in my heart of hearts that this is the story I want to tell, then put it out there, right? And again, get people to read it. And if you get good feedback, they go, yeah, I don't know what it was about this one, I just loved it, then you're good, right? But it's okay to break the genre. One thing I said in my last class, which is worth repeating, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist, right? So let's say you've got this story that's very non-traditional characters, all that kind of stuff. What I would encourage you to do is, if you really want to write that, go for it. I'm not here to stop you, but I would try writing something else that does comport with what, the rules, the formulas, and then feel what that's like. Learn that process by actually doing it. And then when you go back to the thing that is non-traditional, you go, you know what? I get this. I've done it. But this thing over here, I still feel like it's good despite all that. You just got to trust yourself. That's the artist, right? Got time for about one more question if anyone's got one. Going once, going right. Ben, last question. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you had mentioned the two different processes in which I guess you go through like a domino effect of a sequence or a maze effect of a sequence.
Yeah, it's just a metaphor to help you out. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess to clarify, would you sort of pick one and stick to it, or do you kind of bounce back and forth between these two philosophies?
The way my brain works is either one of them's interchangeable. Okay. Because if I knock over a domino and the next domino's far away and it knocks over and doesn't hit it, then I know that I didn't link the scenes well enough, right? It's got to hit it for me, right? Or if I'm in a maze and I make this choice, I'm like, oh, I don't know how to get out of this choice. I must have hit a dead end. I'm going to go back and then try a different thing, right? So for my brain, these are metaphors to help you out. So like, try them, come up with your own, right? These are just ways of like, how am I going to guide myself through this process? It's awesome, y'all. So just FYI, I'm going to be putting out more and more free resources on @RichBaker coaching. So, like little mini lessons, like these are longer classes. I'm going to probably come up with more of these, but like little 5-minute videos, different things like that. And feel free to reach out if you're like, I've got a specific question that didn't occur to me or whatnot. I just want to help writers to write more, to write better, to be satisfied with their creations. So I really appreciate y'all taking the class.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Rich.
Hey.
Thank you, Rich.